Welcome to the Curiosity Crisis. We challenge ourselves to explore the world of business, tech, investing, and science. Get curious and be part of our journey as we discuss, challenge, and learn. Kush, what's been keeping you curious? Straight into it today.
Let's get going, mate. What's been keeping me curious is... So, we talk about books a little bit in the podcast, but I am going to talk about what I'm currently reading right now, which is Mao's Last Dancer. It's a fiction book, but I think we've mentioned before how we're doing lots of reading, and I'm loving the process of learning from fiction. So this one, I'm learning a lot about, I guess, history of China and communism, and how that fed into people's lives there, but then also just like the really different political and structures of society sort of thing, compared to majorly the Western world. And that's topical today because not only we're sort of talking about the economics or global economics, but I'll just leave the teaser there, and obviously society and like those underlying big belief systems also play into that. So it's a bit related, but learning lots about communism and just curious about the world back in the day.
And we have a bit of experience of that firsthand. We traveled to Vietnam together, which is it's a communist country. It's more on the socialist end of the spectrum, less so with it's not quite as totalitarian, but it's very interesting to see the influence when you're in a country.
And
like
just like how the world works like so differently. So really interesting.
Definitely.
What's keeping you curious?
Mine, I don't think mine's quite as interesting as that. But some listeners would know that I'm a software engineer is my profession, and as part of that, I did an Amazon Web Services cloud exam recently, which is cool. But I've kind of what's been keeping me curious about that. So initially, I was studying for the exam, making sure I'd pass, which was all good. But it's more the concept of certifications from big tech, like Google has certs as well, and Microsoft have certs, and it's just the idea of, are you learning the product rather than the kind of the core foundational knowledge of a technology, And so I'm yet to decide exactly what I think, but I felt as though a lot of what I was learning was very product based, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, especially if you use that product. But I don't know. It's been a bit of a calculation of the value that they provide. I guess I've been keeping me curious with that.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like when you go for a job, it's like, do you have experience learning with this software or this type of application? And I reckon they're quite different things, because you can get like really, really specific on the type of software, but all then you've really learned is how to use, a specific brand of software or whatever. Yeah. But you've learned how to learn, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you generally understand the concept, it's probably a different picture.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that one's been on my mind.
Interesting. Well, in the theme of getting right into it, what are we talking about today, Luke?
Yeah, so today we're talking about tariffs. So in a recent episode, we had on Ian, who has worked heavily in investing, and tariffs came up as a conversation. And there's something that's affecting the world right now. But at the Curiosity Crisis, we like to cover topics that are more timeless. We like the idea of it not to be news. That's something that's only relevant at the time of recording. So we're going to take a bit of a historic and holistic look at tariffs and look at like why they were invented, when they were invented, when were they used, how were they used, what were the knock-on effects, and just like see how things have played out in the past. And then we can talk about a little bit about the present. But yeah, we just hope that it'll give our listeners a more holistic understanding of the financial mechanism and tool that tariffs are. Same as any tool. They can be really good for some things and really bad for others. So,
yeah, keen to get into it and keen to understand, I guess, what it all means. And I'm going to be picking your brain. So,
perfect.
Starting right from the basic, what's the idea behind a tariff? What is it?
Yeah, so like I just said, it's a tool. So a tariff it's fundamentally a tax that's imposed by a government on goods crossing into its borders, and so the most common form of that is an import tariff, which is, you're effectively just taxing goods that are coming in. And so they'll do it at customs, they'll do it in like their shipping yards, and that's where the tax is worked out. And so usually it's that tax is paid by the importer of the good, and they're used for various different things. And there's a few main types of tariffs. So there's one called an ad valorem, which is just a percentage of value. Then you have a specific, which is like a fixed amount on like each unit. You can have a compound, which is like a mix of them, and then like a tariff rate quota. So based on the quantity of whatever the item is. So it could be like how many eggs you're importing into your nation and something like that. So yeah, that's kind of the main thing about tariffs.
So it's a type of, or it's a form of a tax, and it's specifically on trade. So it's different to taxes that people like citizens would pay just to their regular government anyway. Okay.
And I think the really important thing to recognize is that they differ based on what it is, right? Generally, like today, for example, your country, whatever country you live in, would have like an import list, and certain things would be taxed at different rates and calculated differently. Sometimes it'll be on like I said before, like how many eggs, and sometimes it'll be like how many tons of coal or whatever it is. And so, they're all different too. And so they usually have like a big index where you can look up what things are taxed at different rates. It's very, very rare that it's just a flat rate on everything.
Yeah. We'll get to that later. So just hold that for 1 second.
Yep.
So why do they ever exist? Why do governments use them? And what's the point of a tariff?
Yeah, so there's a few primary purposes. A historic one that's pretty evident is actually revenue generation. So historically, it's been a major source of government funding. So at one point, for example, it was 90% of the early US federal revenue. And it's still very relevant for developing nations as well, but I guess they just have less of that kind of bargaining power. Yeah. And something that we'll talk about a little bit later, and it's important to note, is where that revenue is actually coming from. Like I mentioned before, the importer is paying that tariff, that tax. So that either means that someone is absorbing the cost or it gets passed on to the consumer, which is going to be internally within that country. So that's something to keep in mind.
Just before you keep going, then it's interesting. So originally it was revenue, and I presume we don't have like specific numbers, but that for at least some of the main countries we're talking about, like the big superpowers, that revenue has changed. So like the US will make its money from a whole range of things, and import tariffs are one part. But so that's changed a lot. And it's just interesting to note that with a really global economy, we talked a lot about Japan in that episode with Ian. It was very interesting, but like certain countries, I think Japan in certain sectors are a net importer, like heavily reliant on import, and countries around the world do that. For example, if you've got poor access to land or water or poor growing conditions, you need to import a lot of your food. So and that's like, security for, the population. So I think sometimes it's important to keep in mind as context, like things can impact different countries or people unevenly.
Yes,
especially
definitely.
If you're a net importer, and essentially the costs come through.
And depending on what you import and export as well. Yeah.
Yes. And probably still on it's a good segue into the next bit. So what are the other like main uses? Yeah,
so one of the next ones that comes to mind obviously is the protection of domestic industries. So, shielding your local industries or firms from foreign competition. And that might be because of military connotations, like when you think of the building of planes or helicopters or ships even. But then it could also be just like a growth industry, right? So it might be related to solar or battery development or electric vehicles or something. And so it's forward thinking in your industry, and that's why you would consider doing that as well. To protect your local. And if you're trying to work out, how does that work? It's effectively you're giving competitive advantage to everything that's internal, right? Because you're able to sell that cheaper than someone else is able to buy it. And so, that's basically why. The other one would be addressing trade imbalances, like we were talking about before with import versus export. And that one's a little bit more debated. But then there's the political leverage and foreign policy. So you could use it to like punish or, threaten essentially like another country, or you could do it it's like the carrot and the stick, right? You could also have it as like a subsidy where you're like, well, we'll massively reduce tariffs if you sell us blah blah blah, and you can have a bit of an agreement. And then we touched on national security. and then consumer protection, so shielding consumers from potentially unsafe imports. So you might massively tariff something where you don't want to make it illegal, but you don't really want whatever that is to be consumed a lot in your country. So yeah, there's a number of reasons why you would consider using them.
And I think like it's interesting. We'll get more to how we've reached potentially more free trade when they're used as like the subsidy, like you said, like sort of allies would be more likely to encourage trade between countries. One of the interesting ones though is when we're talking about revenue in the last one, for example, if you don't have too many really good primary industries in your country and you are importing a lot of different things of high value, then a government probably has a likelihood to tax or tariff some of those imports more. And this is just my thinking, so correct me if I'm wrong.
No, go for it.
But tax it more because they need to make that income to support the society and economy.
Yeah, definitely. And this is the thing as well, where it also really depends on the type of country you are. So, for example, if you're very like agriculture based, you're much more likely to tariff other agriculture industries because that's something you produce a lot of. So why wouldn't you try and keep that within the walls of your country, right? So an example for us would be Australia has a huge meat economy. So we tariff a lot of, imported meat because we have so much of it here. Why would we, we want to support our local industry with that. Yeah. But then if you didn't, for example, you probably don't have maybe any tariffs on meat imports if produce any as a country. So it's very dependent on what your economy looks like.
Today's episode is sponsored by OptiVenture, the ultimate all-in-one supplement system crafted exclusively for hikers and outdoor adventurers. OptiVenture's unique day and night formulas provide everything you need, from essential vitamins and minerals to probiotics and omega-3s, timed perfectly to match your body's rhythm. The day formula boosts energy, immunity, and mental clarity, keeping you strong and focused on the trail, and the night formula supports deep recovery, reduces inflammation, and promotes restful sleep so you wake up ready for the next adventure. Join the tribe and elevate your outdoor experience. Check out optiventure.co to learn more. Yeah, it's so interesting. We can go in for ages, but it's like, we can go into it for ages, but even like thinking in the Australian context, we export a lot of raw materials, but then import a lot of finished products.
Yeah.
For example, iron ore and then importing steel. So it's just interesting how it works, and we'll get into like why free trade and something that has become a thing. But before we get there, let's take a look back. Where did tariffs come from? Have they always been around?
Yeah, so something that really surprised me on the research for this episode is the history of tariffs and how far back they actually go. They've been around for thousands and thousands of years. I believe the first recorded use of tariffs was in Assyria, but there's other examples in Egypt, Greece, Rome, and so they've actually been widely used for thousands of years.
Wow.
But I think the first one that we might touch on would be Egypt. It's an easy one to understand because Egypt as a country is still geographically the same. And that is that Egypt used to tax the imports and exports along the Nile River, which was used so much for trade, right?
Okay.
And also the Red Sea is a really common trade route. And so they had this pharaoh called Thutmose III, and he levied customs duties on goods for like incense and gold, especially items that would be considered more luxuries as well. And so, it led to some prosperity because they would generate revenue from all of this trade traffic. But eventually there was kind of a foreign dependence where Egypt relied really heavily on their tariffs and their trade monopoly, especially for grain and papyrus, which traveled a lot through there. And it meant that they were really vulnerable to Rome when the Roman Empire really expanded, and it was around 30 BC that economic policy essentially it came back to bite them a bit.
Yeah, right. So initially it funded their like some amazing things in their society, like their pyramids and temples.
Yeah,
but then later on, it came full circle.
Yeah. And I think this is going to be a bit of a common theme. So Greece, so Athens in about the 5th and 4th century BC, they imposed port taxes, especially on grain, and that was to ensure food security. And so city-states like Corinth, which is still there, they taxed ships that passed through their waters. And so you had Hellenistic kingdoms using tariffs to protect local economies. And it was a similar thing. So you had high grain tariffs, which that helped Athens feed its population and discouraged rivals like in the area. Yep. And one of the problems was it caused trade rivalries, right? Like you had port taxes sometimes would lead to conflicts, like they'd have to fight because, some other kingdom was, not stoked about the tariffs that they were placing on certain items. And eventually, with Greece, there was a wealth concentration at the top where tariffs enriched all these mercantile elites, and it led to inflation, actually.
Yeah.
And so, Alexander the Great, he came down, and Greece was flooded with Persian silver, and there was all these problems, and there was all this inflation, and it was this big problem. And
yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's so a couple of things there. That's interesting. It's kind of like the common day example is a little bit like gentrification,
Yes.
different areas,
Yeah.
Wealth comes in, floods, pushes up prices, pushes like other people, maybe commoners if you want to call it, out. And then one thing that I'm picking up, and I want to come back to it later on in the episode, but so a couple of key things that made tariffs pretty initially useful in these examples is like they were very particular. So to get certain goods you had to go through certain port lines, so or shipping lines, and there was no other way or a very hard way to get it. Like you couldn't import the same thing from South America because it was prohibitive. So I want to think about that today, where it's a lot easier to get things all around the world compared to way back in the day. How does that change? But I can understand where it comes from, so that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think something that you kind of just touched on was the world was much smaller thousands and thousands of years ago. And so the regions in which they're tariffing was different. And so, the trade routes were really important.
Alrighty.
Yeah, so one more quick example would be Rome. And I think the main thing, so this is, again, 4th, 5th century. This was CE. And they had an overtaxation and expensive frontier defenses, which weakened their economy. So, the collapse of the Roman Empire was happening anyway. But there's definitely some speculation that the tariffs that they'd imposed really, hastened that collapse.
Yep.
And it definitely didn't help with conflict. So,
All right, well, so that's a look down history lane, but it's really interesting to see where they came from. What about, I guess, more recently, something that we can draw on in the last couple 100 years?
Yeah, so I think we should look at there's probably 3 main examples that have been within the last few 100 years, which would be really applicable here. So one of them is Britain's corn laws. So Britain, this is between 1815 and 1846. So they had high tariffs on imported grain to protect the landowners. But what ended up happening was it harmed the urban workers, right? Because they're now experiencing higher food prices. So you're trying to, help one group of people, and it's hindering another group of people. So they had intense opposition, and the Irish potato famine led to the repeal of this in 1846.
Yeah.
And it had this big shift in Britain's history towards free trade. And so, essentially the lower income groups were really heavily affected by this. And that was only a couple 100 years ago.
So that's interesting because that also in some ways happened in the first few centuries. So really interesting. What about some of the American examples?
Yeah, so we've got 2 American examples. One of them was the McKinley tariff, which was in 1890. So everyone knows that Donald Trump has referenced tariffs, and he referred to the tariff king, and that was President McKinley. And so he served 2 US presidential terms. And essentially what he did was he raised the average duties on nearly everything by about 50%. And he was trying to protect US industry, but it led to massive spikes in prices. And there was this huge public backlash. And some economists believe that it led, or at least contributed, to the 1893 economic shutdown, which is this huge downturn that they had. And there are a lot of problems with that, but I believe that's what we were referring to before when we were saying that a large portion of early American revenue was coming from tariffs. This was at this time.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, interesting. So they, again, maybe initially worked or had good intentions for the people of the states, but then, learning that lesson.
And so then we've got one more, and this is the more recent one and one that people are more likely to know, and that's the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So we know about the Great Depression, and farmers started struggling in the late 1920s. Yeah. And so Congress tried to help with tariffs, and so they introduced the Smoot-Hawley Act of the 1930s. So there was this senator called Reed Smoot and a representative called Willis Hawley, and they introduced the act, and the aim of it was to help defend from foreign agriculture products, right? So they were trying to help out the agriculture industry within the US. And so this bill went through Congress, but as it was going through Congress, all these other constituents wanted to add to the bill, right? They wanted to help out. What about mining? What about manufacturing? Yep. So all these other industries start to get tacked on to this bill because everyone's thinking, oh, this is a great idea. We're going to protect our industry. And so by the time the bill gets through Congress, there was 890 different tariffs that were going to be enforced. And so there was this huge backlash, actually, for President Hoover by all of these US economists. And there was there was over 1,000 of them that signed this petition to say, like, please don't do this. It's not a good idea. And despite that, he proceeded. So basically, the economists were predicting that other countries would retaliate to the US, and it would cause everything to spike up in price, and it would lead to a lot of economic issues in the future. So the result was predicted, and other nations did retaliate with the tariffs after it got passed. An example impact of that was, so farmers exported around 12 million eggs to Canada at the time. And after they implemented the tariffs, within like less than a year, it had gone down 99%, and they were down to 170,000 eggs, which is insane.
Crazy, because like obviously, so Canada probably could have done it themselves initially, but it was like it was working, the system was working, they were importing eggs and happy to not do it themselves and focus on other things. But then when the prices got so prohibited, then they had to look for alternatives, do it themselves, get it from elsewhere. Done. That's it.
And that's the thing, right? You could just, eggs were not an exclusive thing that the US had. They could get them somewhere else. So it really, really damaged that type of farming. And so eventually the US automobile, iron and steel exports all dropped by 90% as well. 80%. And the act provoked widespread foreign retaliation. It caused a collapse in global trade, which is estimated to have gone down about 66% by 1934. So that was only a couple of years. And it significantly deepened and prolonged the Great Depression. And it just caused a lot of economic issues. Yeah, right. And it's a really good example of protectionism and trade wars, and how there was this big shift in the US trade policy right after that, and really looked to create allies rather than enforce tariffs on everyone.
I guess the world right now, we're talking about tariffs and things happening, but overwhelmingly it seems much more, even with this trend, like much more free trade oriented.
Yeah.
How do we get from that act to what we have now?
Yeah, well, if you notice some of the dates on that previous tariff, we're talking about the early 1930s. And if you know much about history, that led into World War II by the end of the 1930s. And so we had a war, and then coming out of a war, there was basically a post-World War II consensus, which was favoring international economic cooperation. And so there was this thing that was formed called the GATT, the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that happened in 1947. And effectively, there were like some fundamental principles that they had. So like non-discrimination. So you wouldn't favor another nation. You'd have reciprocity, which is talking about mutual exchange of concessions. Transparency, so you wouldn't like hide your tariffs, you'd just make them public. So if I say I want to sell product X to this country next door, they'll let me know what I'm going to get taxed, essentially, getting it into the nation. And then tariff preferences, so favoring tariffs of a quantitative restrictions. So over quantitative. So rather than having quotas on like this much and that much, which would have to be looked at all the time, you're better off to do percentages, right? So we'll tax this by 5%, or we'll tax, whatever. So smaller, like tariffs that are more clear and easier to follow as well.
Like overall percentage on a certain type of good or something, or, like Australia will only, as an example, will at maximum import 20% of this type of good.
Just jumping in for a quick break. We'd love it if you did us a favor and gave us a 5-star review on your podcast player. We'd really appreciate it. It helps grow the podcast and get to more ears. Thank you.
Well, yeah, it was more about like a quota of like this many 100,000 tons or something, or this many million tons, because that's harder to track. It needs to be revised more. There's a lot more rather than just having, all right, well, whenever we import this, we're going to have a tariff of 6% or something.
Gotcha.
It's just more straightforward as well. And then kind of that was the beginning of it, and they wanted to do all these reduction rounds. So there was a bunch of rounds to try and reduce the tariffs, and eventually they fell from around 20% down to about 5%. And anyway, the GATT formed into the World Trade Organization in 1995, and that's basically where we are today. So there's this big economic impact coming from the GATT and the WTO. And so now we've kind of experienced this long period of free trade and really globally integrated trade. And so now we're here where we have kind of tariffs coming more into the conversation again. And
So just on that, like where we are sort of here, let's talk about now, 1995 onwards to 2020s. What does that sort of look like? Like, have things improved? I know, just giving a couple of examples, like where it's really front of mind, half the stuff you can just buy anything online, and it comes from who knows, China, Africa, the US, South America. Like, things come from all over the world. A lot of the services, like even internet services and things you use every day on your phone, have definitely been have most likely been developed in countries other than your own, and they don't only come from one place. So like, that's just experiencing day-to-day life. But
definitely,
what has it meant generally, like for the global economy?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the key takeaway, actually, is that the whole world is so much more integrated into every economy is integrated into other economies. And so, the amount of trade that happens now is just so much more than anything that would have used to happen. Going from a tariff on grain and timber, and then that's it. A very short list to... We have thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of products and commodities that go all the way around the world. And so any form of tariff, any form of percentage is going to impact everything that is. And especially when it's something that's foundational, like a commodity that then gets consumed for the creation of other things. And then it affects everything else, right? So whether that's your, you have some tariff on some kind of feed that gets used in all farming, which means that all food prices now go up. And something that we touched on before as well is like, who's actually paying that tariff? If I have a tariff on you, Kush, if I say 10% of everything you sell me, I'm going to tariff because for whatever reason, I'm doing that. What's going to happen is I'm going to pass that on to the consumer, the person who's buying my product, because I don't feel like absorbing that 10% off the revenue I make. So I'll just pass it on, right? And so what ends up happening is it's actually the consumers that pay that price. And that's fine in a lot of circumstances. We talked about it, especially in terms of national security. There's a lot of really common reasons why you would want to tariff something. But I just think, the world has become a very different place to some of these examples that we talked about. This isn't ancient Rome anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting.
Yeah, globalization and just like how we consume things is just meant that everything, like things come from everywhere. Like you look around your room, your car, your workplace, like the origins of all of that stuff, that those goods and services we consume have come from everywhere. So I guess generally, like, there's been more trade growth and like it has improved certain standards of living around the world because you're getting easier, cheaper and quicker access to lots of different goods and services that maybe you can't make in your backyard. And I guess it has been good for especially developing countries to access some of the stuff that comes from some of those really developed economies, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what's happening today then? Like, is it changing? Are we going back to the early centuries or what's happening?
Yeah, so, it's pretty commonly understood that there's a US-China trade war, and it's been going on for quite a while now, from before Joe Biden was president, and now Donald Trump's president, which has continued that trade war. And there's kind of been a resurgence in protectionism. And I think a lot of it is stemming from national security concerns. But I think that as well, and we talked about tariffs being a revenue-generating tool, it's a way of obfuscating a tax that you put on people.
Wait, explain that again. Like,
well,
what's obfuscating?
It's a way of, if you add tariffs to things, you can generate revenue as a country, assuming that your exports don't decrease. And it's a way of extracting monetary value out of the same things that you already have. And if you're a country with a lot of debt, for example, you could imagine it being a potential way of trying to solve that problem. Now, I don't know whether it will or not. I'm not an economist. But I think there's some logic that's gone into the reasons why things have played out the way they have. But yeah, I mean, the jump to... So previously, there was 125% tariff that the US and China decided to place on each other's goods, right? So that was the tariff that they both had. And at that level, that's a ridiculously high tariff. That's ridiculous. That effectively that shuts down trade between the two countries. That's what that's realistically what it's doing. And so it becomes who can put up with the pain longer. And I think that's what we've seen is that because the world is so integrated and there is so much trade in the globalist economy that we have, like no one really wants to be in a trade war. is the end result.
Exactly. It makes a lot of things harder, but also because the rest of the world is really globalized. For example, two countries, we've talked about US and China in strategic competition. You can sort of go, you can, for certain things, go elsewhere, like US or China won't be the only countries producing a certain good, but so you can go elsewhere. But obviously, you know, those two countries, we know superpowers, tons of goods and services come out of both those countries. And, you know, for example, China is massive in the manufacturing and production side of things. So that not only affects the US, but then the rest of the world, if they start putting up their prices and we, like you talked about, like you raise the cost of something early in the supply chain and everything starts to get really expensive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm like, there is a shift as well. Like we talked a lot about the green or like investment into renewables and into net zero sort of thing. And some countries will where because it's such a new large opportunity. Some countries are saying, no, we'll do it in-house. We're going to do it ourselves, partly for security, but partly also for trying to generate prosperity in something that's it's a major trend. But there's also the other side of it that, you know, if for example, China's already producing a hell of a lot of these things like wind farms and solar panels and batteries and stuff like that, if everyone tries to do it themselves, that just inevitably puts up the cost.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
It definitely,
there is a lot going on.
Yeah, you definitely don't need every player in the game working on building the same industry, right? That's the whole point of trade. And yeah, I mean, we'll see how things play out. But you raise a really good point there. And especially where, you know, security interests end up aligning in the same areas, right? Like everyone's like, we want, you know, energy security and we want like the ability to make our own planes. Like everyone would have that's ideal. Yep. But the reality is not every country in the world is going to build that industry. That's just not how it works.
Yeah, and you just can't. Like, you're just trying to replicate the same thing. Yeah. And it's kind of reversing. Obviously, the ideologies might reverse to saying, like, oh, we want to protect our national interests. But essentially the economy and, like, how connected the world isn't really going to stop because of the internet, because of how things have gone for the last, 30, 40 years. So, yeah. All right, let's wrap it up. We're pushing time here. What does this all mean? Do tariffs work? I know this is a blanket statement, and it's probably not a blanket answer, but what's your take?
I think my take is they're an old tool. They've been around for a long time, and they are useful in certain areas. We see that, we saw the prosperity in Egypt and Greece, and there are good uses of tariffs, definitely. But a blanket tariff on things has never, or on like a lot of imports, has never really, at least historically, proven to be advantageous for anyone. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, I'd seem to agree. Like, I think, obviously, I don't know heaps about it. I'm not an expert, but this is the opinion section. So
yeah, exactly.
I think, tariffs are that generally, as a blanket, they don't work. I think it is fair for balancing certain countries. If you can't produce all sorts of things, but you still have a large population, you might need to tax imports. However, in a fair way that still makes it attractive that countries will want to sell to you, because exports for big exporting countries are the way they make their money. So I think there's definitely a balancing act, and they do have a role in the world for certain things, but not over the top because it just creates huge inefficiencies and wasted money, and obviously then that flows down to hardships because things always have a knock-on effect.
Definitely, couldn't agree more.
Awesome. Well, maybe we should wrap it up there. Thanks for listening. Find us at curiositycrisis.com and Curiosity Crisis on Instagram. We're on all major streaming services, so you can listen how you like. We have to ask a favour. If you got anything out of this episode and are getting value from the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review on your podcast player. That helps us be found by more listeners, and it helps grow the podcast. So thank you, and catch you on the next episode.